Well, it's truly a pleasure to have you to join us once again in this course, Macroeconomics. And we are moving on to Lecture 5 Part A, where we'll be discussing the whole issue of interest rates and how they are determined according to the field of economics. So, this chapter is going to enable students to be able to define what interest rates are. You will be able to explain interest rate determination from the classicalist view, explain what causes a demand for loanable funds, explain where the supply of loanable funds originate, and this lecture is based upon chapter 4 of the macroeconomics text that we have been using throughout this course, and the title is Classical Macroeconomics, Money, Prices, and Interest. So in this particular lecture, we will simply be focusing on how interest rates are determined according to the classicalist point of view. Now, the reality is, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the term interest rates. I mean, many of us on several occasions may visit a commercial bank to be able to acquire or borrow money because you may want to purchase a vehicle, you may want to purchase a house, you may want to purchase some other appliance or go on a trip, and you may not have the necessary income on you currently. So what you seek to do is go and borrow. So what we realize is that in society there are situations that exist where there are some people who want to engage in some form of expenditure, but they may not have the current income. But there are also some people in society who may not want to engage in expenditure at this point in time, and therefore they defer their consumption and choose to save. So what we see is that in society there are two forms of individuals when it comes to saving and lending. There are borrowers, individuals who want to consume today, but they may not have the current income, and there are savers, those who do not want to consume today and may therefore defer their consumption for future periods and thus choose to save today. And that's what the banking system does for us. The bank is an intermediary. It brings together borrowers and lenders. Now, we are looking at the classicalist view with regards to interest rate. And what we would realize that interest rate, it has two sides to the coin. Interest rate is the cost to a borrower to acquiring a loan, whereas it is the reward to the saver for lending money in form of a loan. So interest rate is both a cost and a reward. It is a cost to the borrower, but it is a reward to the saver or the lender. Now, again, you hear me keep reiterating that we're looking at interest rate determination from the classicalist point of view. The reason being is that there are many other theories, for instance, Keynesian point of view as to how interest rates are actually determined. But where the commonality rests is simply that interest rate is a cost to a borrower and a reward to the saver. So the classicalist theory is known as the loanable funds theory. Now, it is important to note that in the view of the classicalists, money has no value. Money has no value at all. And as we progress throughout this chapter, we'll realize that there is a need to introduce the concept of bonds as we seek to explain the classicalist theory of loanable funds. So we have answered the question of what interest rates are. They're a cost to the borrower, but they are a reward to the saver. And there are different types of interest rates. You may have to pay a particular interest rate for a housing loan, and that interest rate may differ for a car loan, or the interest rate will differ on your credit card. So there are many different types of interest rates applied to different types of commodities. So it is important to note that in economics, the price of any product is determined in the marketplace. And from what we simply discussed before, interest rates can be seen as a price. It is the price that a borrower pays to acquire a loan. I repeat, the interest rate is the price that a borrower pays to acquire a loan. So we realize that interest rate is a price. And in economics, all prices for any good or service is determined within the marketplace. And we will see that interaction as we progress throughout this lecture. So we need to realize that occasions will exist, as previously discussed, where people will want to consume more than their income will allow. So we're going to focus on the firms and the government in this particular example as we introduce the fact that in order to borrow, bonds must be issued. Now, why must bonds be issued for savings or lending to take place? In the view of the classicalists, money is simply to facilitate transactions. Money has no value, and therefore, if savings has to take place, a financial instrument must be created that could store value. In the view of the classicalists, that financial instrument can be a bond, and therefore a bond is a financial instrument that can store value over a period of time. An interest rate can be applied to a bond, and therefore when a bond is issued, whether it is by a firm or the government, the person who issues the bond will receive money when they sell the bond, and when the bond has matured, whoever holds the bond, the purchaser of the bond, will now return the bond to either the firm or the government, whosoever issued it, and therefore the holder of that bond will receive their principal and their interest. So bonds are that financial instrument that will allow individuals to save. So let us look at how borrowing takes place. Let us analyze the demand for loanable funds. Again, I'm reiterating, the interest rate is a price. It is the price for loanable funds, the price to borrow funds, and a price to the supplier of the funds. And therefore, it is determined, interest rates, it is determined in the market for loanable funds. So we're now going to discuss what is the demand for loanable funds. Borrowing, as we said, can occur by a business or the state, and this will be via the issuing of bonds. So when the firm wants to borrow, they're going to issue bonds. And when they issue these bonds, they place them on the market so that customers can purchase these bonds. When customers purchase these bonds, when the bond matures, they can bring it again and they will receive their principal and interest. The higher the rate of interest on a bond, the more the firm or the state or whomsoever issues the bond will have to pay at the end of the period. So the higher the rate of interest, the more that has to be paid out when the bond has to be redeemed. The lower the rate of interest, the less that the issue of the bond has to pay out when the bond has to be redeemed. In that case, what we can see will arise is that an inverse relationship between the rate of interest and the demand for funds to borrow in the form of issuing bonds will be inverse. What do I mean? Let's take our eyes and focus upon this diagram before us here. We have the interest rates on the y-axis and we have the demand for loanable funds on the x-axis. What I'm saying is that given an interest rate of approximately 1%, that is a very low rate of interest, and therefore firms may be willing to borrow a lot of money at this low rate of interest because it means when they have to pay out, when the bonds become redeemable, they will not have to pay out much because there's a low interest rate. So at a low interest rate, firms will be willing to borrow a lot of money. So at 1% rate of interest, approximately $4,000 may be demanded in loanable funds. However, if the rate of interest increases from approximately 1% to now 5%, firms will be willing to borrow less, simply because when the bonds have to be redeemed, they will have to pay out more money. So at a higher rate of interest, firms will be willing to borrow less money and therefore issue less bonds. And that will be seen by the demand for loanable funds moving from approximately $4,000 to approximately $1,000. So what we see here, as the rate of interest increases from 1% to 5%, the demand for loanable funds moves from $4,000 to $1,000. So as the rate of interest goes up, the demand for loanable funds goes down. And we see that in this particular diagram. So this gives rise to a downward sloping demand curve for loanable funds from left to right. Downward sloping curve from left to right for the demand for loanable funds. So I'm going to go through an actual construction, or we're going to derive the demand curve for loanable funds at this point in time so you can actually see the process take place. So remember, we're discussing, or we're going to look at how the demand for loanable funds curve will be derived. We know what it looks like, but let's derive it by rationalizing. So let's say the rate of interest is at 1%. So we're at 1% right now. Remember, we're looking at the demand for loanable funds. So at a rate of interest, because the rate of interest to the borrower is a cost, at a lower cost, they will be willing to borrow more money as opposed to less. So at a rate of interest of 1, we can expect the firms to be willing to borrow a lot of money, more money than they would have borrowed if the rate of interest was higher. So at 1%, let's say they borrow approximately $7,000. So therefore, they will issue bonds worth $7,000. And therefore, where it intersects, we have our first coordinate point. Now, for whatever reasons, interest rates may begin to rise. And a rise in interest rates will result in the next time when firms want to borrow, they may be willing to borrow less because the cost to borrow has now risen. So let's assume that interest rates have risen to approximately 7%. At a rate of 7%, firms will no longer be willing to borrow as much as $7,000. This time, they may borrow approximately $2,000. So at 7%, firms will be willing to borrow approximately $2,000 at that rate of interest. So we have our second coordinate point. When we join these 2 points together, we realize our curve naturally will be downward sloping from left to right. You realize I didn't draw the curve first. We understood the relationship that exists between the interest rate and the demand for loanable funds. When the rate of interest was at 1%, the demand to borrow loanable funds will be very high because the cost is low. So at 1%, $7,000 was approximately demanded. However, when the rate of interest went up to 7%, what we saw is that the demand for loanable funds reduced to a new value of $2,000 this time. So we realize that it gives rise to a curve. When you join the 2 points, it gives rise to a curve that is downward sloping from left to right. We can look at anything else. Let's look at a rate of interest. Let's look at it moving from 7% to 4%. If we move from 7% to 4%, look what happens. If you look at it, we already have our line. So look at 4, come across. And at 4%, 4,000 is demanded. So when we move from 7%, we move from a demand of $2,000 to a new demand of $4,000. So when interest rate fell from 7% to 4%, the demand for loanable funds now increased from $2,000 to $4,000. So what we simply see here is that the rate of interest, when it changes, when there's a decrease in the rate of interest, firms will be willing to borrow more. A fall in the rate of interest results in a demand to borrow more money, and therefore firms will issue more bonds. However, when the rate of interest was to increase, for instance, when we saw it 1% up to 7%, it moved from $7,000 to a new value of $2,000. So there's a decrease. So we can conclude with this statement. As the rate of interest increases, the demand for loanable funds will decrease. But when the rate of interest decreases, the demand for loanable funds will increase. It therefore states that there is an inverse relationship between the price of loanable funds, which will be the interest rates, and the demand for loanable funds. Remember we said before that the interest rate, it is a reward to the saver. Individuals who want to save will be willing to save more money when the interest rate is higher because it's an incentive. And if the interest rate is lower, they will be willing to save less money. So the supply of loanable funds comes from individuals that are willing to save. Savings occurs when bonds are purchased by individuals because the customer will forfeit present consumption in order to acquire or purchase the bond. It therefore means that the higher the rate of interest on the bond, the greater the incentive to save by the individual. This means that it will purchase more bonds. This increases the supply of loanable funds. However, the lower the rate of interest on the bond, the lower the incentive to save. As a result of this, households or individuals will purchase less bonds, therefore reducing or decreasing the supply of loanable funds. We can therefore conclude that a positive relationship exists between the rate of interest and the supply of loanable funds, meaning as the rate of interest goes up, the higher the incentive and therefore the greater the supply of loanable funds. However, as the rate of interest goes down, the lower the incentive and therefore the lower the supply of loanable funds. And we can see that here in this diagram. As the rate of interest moves from R1, where the quantity supplied will be a low amount, QS1, as it goes up to R2, what we see is that the willingness to save increases, and therefore this increases the supply from QS1 to QS2 in loanable funds. And therefore it intersects at this point, and when we draw the line, we have an upward sloping supply curve for loanable funds, an upward sloping from left to right supply curve for loanable funds. So again, let's go through this process before you so you can actually see how we derive the supply curve for loanable funds. And after that, we're going to pull it all together to see how we determine the interest rate when we look at equilibrium. Remember, the supply of loanable funds comes from those individuals who are willing to save. That is, those individuals who are willing to purchase bonds today, thus forfeiting consumption on other goods and services and deferring it to a future time period when they redeem the bond and receive both principal and interest. So, individuals who want to save, they purchase bonds. All right, therefore increasing the supply of loanable funds when they purchase these bonds. Now, interest rate is that incentive. It is that reward to the saver when they save. And if it is a reward, it means the lower the reward, the lower the incentive. So at a low rate of interest, what we can expect is that there will be a low supply. So at 1%, we can assume that savers will only be willing to purchase about $1,000 in bonds, meaning that there is now a low supply of bonds. We have our first coordinate point. But as the interest rate increases to approximately 7%, what we see, or what we can assume, is that as the reward or the incentive to save increases, people will now be willing to purchase more bonds, therefore supplying more loanable funds. So there's a movement to purchase about $7,000 worth of bonds, and therefore there's a supply of $7,000 worth in loanable funds available. Therefore, what we see is that the supply for loanable funds curve is upward sloping from left to right. As the rate of interest went up, the supply for loanable funds went up. Now, let's say interest rate fell from 7% to 4%. 7%. Look what happens. When the interest rate fell from 7% to 4%, what we now saw is that the supply of loanable funds moved from 7,000 and went to 4,000. So again, what we're seeing here, as the rate of interest falls, also the supply of loanable funds falls. As the rate of interest increases, the supply of loanable funds increases. It therefore tells us or shows us that there is a positive or a direct relationship that exists between the rate of interest and the quantity supplied of loanable funds, meaning that they both move together. As one variable goes up, the other variable goes up, or as the one variable goes down, the other variable goes down. As a result of this, the supply for loanable funds curve is upward sloping from left to right. So we have derived our supply for loanable funds curve. Again, we have not drawn it based upon how we want the curve to look, but the shape was has arisen because of the relationship between the interest rates and the supply of loanable funds, which we have now simply instructed. So let me label this as supply for loanable funds. So having done that, what we are now able to do is combine the demand curve for loanable funds and the supply curve for loanable funds. And when we combine these two diagrams on one diagram, we will be able to determine the equilibrium rate of interest. This will be where the demand for loanable funds curve and the supply for loanable funds curve intersect. And at the point of intersection, what we have is equilibrium. And we will determine, therefore, the equilibrium rate of interest and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, which means at that point, the demand for loanable funds will equal the supply for loanable funds. And we see that here in this diagram. So we have our demand for loanable funds curve, we have our supply for loanable funds curve, and where they intersect, it yields an equilibrium rate of interest and an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. And therefore, whatever value RE takes, that will be the rate of interest for whatever loan that it is consumers will be willing to take within the market, in according to the classicalist theory. Okay, so let's now determine the rate of interest, what it will be. Remember, the rate of interest is determined according to market conditions, and this is when equilibrium occurs between the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds curve. So because we know what these curves will look like, we can quickly draw them. So our demand for loanable funds curve will be downward sloping from left to right, and our supply for loanable funds curve will be upward sloping from left to right. So DL, SL. And therefore what we see is that at the point of intersection, what it gives rise is to our equilibrium rate of interest, RE, and we realize RE is actually equal to 4%. And our equilibrium level of loanable funds will be QE, and in this case, QE is equal to $3,000. So in this particular market, what we realize is that the rate of interest will be at 4%. This is the rate of interest that consumers will face for whatever loan they are taking, and the amount that will be demanded and supplied will be $3,000 worth of loanable funds. Okay, so that is how we can illustrate interest rate determination according to the classicalist viewpoint. So we realize that the interest rate is determined when there is equilibrium between the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. It means therefore that anytime there is a change in the equilibrium position between the demand for loanable funds and the supply for loanable funds, it will bring about a change in the equilibrium rate of interest. So it is very important for us to determine what can cause a change, whether it's an increase or decrease in the demand for loanable funds, or an increase or decrease in the supply of loanable funds, which will be represented by upward or downward shifts in both the demand and supply for loanable funds curve, respectively. So, factors causing changes in the demand for loanable funds will be changes in business expectations with respect to the future by firms, and also changing in the spending patterns by the state. Example, by the government moving from a surplus or even a balanced budget to now running a deficit budget. If a government runs a deficit budget, that budget will have to be financed by borrowing, and therefore this will result in the government increasing their demand for loanable funds, and we could see the demand for loanable funds curve changing. Also, factors causing changes in the supply for loanable funds will be a change in the income of savers. If individuals have more income available to them, it means for any given rate of interest, they can actually save more if they so choose. Also, the converse is true. If for some reason an individual experiences a reduction in their income, maybe a new job, or they've lost their job and they've only been able to acquire another job that pays lower, it means for every given rate of interest, they now will only be able to save less. Additionally, changes in the income could occur because of changes in income tax. Income tax changes will bring about a change in the disposable income of the individual. And therefore, if income tax was to increase, it means there's a lower rate or there's a lower level of disposable income available to the consumer. As a result of that, that can also change the supply of loanable funds. Additionally, if the tax rate was to decrease, it increases the disposable income available to the consumer, resulting in them being able to save more for every given rate of interest. Also, changes in expectation about future inflation rates will also affect the supply of loanable funds. If you think about it, remember inflation reduces the value of money. And if the value of money is expected to fall in the future, then individuals will be willing to spend more today, thus meaning they will be saving less. So if the future expectation about inflation rates get worse, get glim, meaning that the inflation rates for the future are expected to increase, then there will be an increase in consumption and a reduction in savings, resulting in a reduction in the loanable funds available to be in the form of loans. Additionally, if inflation rates are expected to fall or diminish, then individuals will have no fear to save, and we can see an increase in the supply of loanable funds. All of these examples I will now seek to explain or illustrate via diagrams as we conclude our discussion upon this chapter. Now, it is important to realize that any changes, as described before, any changes that take place in the supply of loanable funds curve or the demand for loanable funds curve in the form of a shifting of either curves will bring about a new equilibrium position. And a new equilibrium position would mean a new equilibrium rate of interest. So let's illustrate that here in this diagram. So as was stated before, when you look at the demand for loanable funds, if businesses expect business to boom in the future, they may want to invest in their business today. That means that their demand for loanable funds will increase. So this can be shown by a rightward shift in your demand for loanable funds curve to DL1, a rightward shift, and therefore we have a new equilibrium rate of interest, a new equilibrium position. It gives rise to a new equilibrium level of interest rates and a new equilibrium level of loanable funds. So we see interest rates will be approximately 5.5%, and the new level of loanable funds that will be demanded and supplied will be a little bit, maybe approximately $41 or $4,200. Sorry, yes, $41 or $4,200. So initially, before the change in demand took place, the rate of interest was 4% and equilibrium was approximately around $3,000. Now we have a higher rate of interest and a higher equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. And this is very intuitive. If you think about it, if firms have higher business expectations and they believe that the future holds good things for their business, they will be willing to borrow at a higher rate of interest. And therefore, if they want your money, they're going to have to be willing to pay a higher rate of interest to acquire, to incentivize you to borrow, to save. Because remember, it is individuals who save by purchasing bonds that supplies money to firms who want to borrow. So again, if firms believe that business is going to boom in the future, they will be willing to invest today. And they will be willing to invest at higher rates of interest simply because they want to get your money today so that they could take advantage of whatever business opportunities that they expect to occur. As a result, they will have to pay you a higher rate of interest to get your money. So an increase in the demand for loanable funds as firms' business expectations rise will bring about a higher rate of interest, and therefore there will be a higher level of loanable funds that will be demanded and supplied. Okay? Now, likewise, we can say that if business expectations were low, meaning it decreased in a particular year, the converse would also be true, in that we can see that the demand for loanable funds will have moved from DL1 to DL, which will bring about a reduction in the equilibrium rate of interest from 5.5% to now 4%. So if business expectations would have been revised, and it means that firms will no longer be willing to borrow at such a high rate of interest because they realize that things are not going to go well. So if they so choose to invest, they may not be willing to pay a high rate of interest at the end when the bond matures. Thus, they will lower the rate of interest and therefore borrow at a lower cost. All right, so let's examine the change changes that will take place in the rate of interest when there's a change in the supply of loanable funds. Now, why would individuals change how much they want to save? If you think about an issue such as inflation, what you would recognize is that inflation reduces the value of money. And therefore, if savers expect the inflation rate to rise in the future, they will recognize that their money will be worth nothing tomorrow, and therefore they want to spend as much as they can today. It therefore means that their willingness to save will reduce when the expectation of inflation increases. As a result of that, you would see a reduction in the supply of loanable funds represented by a leftward shift in the supply curve. And this leftward shift will result in the rate of interest increasing. However, with the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds reducing. So previously we saw that when the demand for loanable funds, all right, that should be SL1. So previously we saw that when the demand for loanable funds increased, there was an increase in the rate of interest, but there was also an increase in the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. In this scenario, however, when there was a fall in the supply of loanable funds, what we saw was an increase also in the interest rate, but a decrease in the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. Why would this occur? Again, remember, if people are willing to save less as a result of inflation, then firms who want to borrow have to compete against other firms who want to borrow with a smaller pool of people who are willing to save. And the only way a firm can compete is by utilizing a higher rate of interest to attract the smaller pool of savers to their firm and therefore purchase their bonds. So, as people desire to save less because of higher inflation rate expectations, firms will be willing to have a higher rate of interest being charged upon the bonds that they're issuing. However, because savings are lower and purchasing bonds are lower, there will be a lower level of equilibrium quantity. So, when savings falls, as represented by a leftward shift in your supply for loanable funds curve, there will be a higher rate of equilibrium, a higher equilibrium rate of interest, but a lower equilibrium level of loanable funds. The converse, my friends, is also true. If the supply of loanable funds initially started at SL1 and at interest rate 5% and equilibrium quantity 2,000, if inflation rates expectations were to diminish, in that individuals believe that the inflation rate will be very low in the future, it will reduce in the future, people will have an incentive to save more, and therefore this will bring about a rightward shift in the supply for loanable funds from SL1 to SL. It therefore means that it will reduce the rate of interest and increase the equilibrium quantity, simply because when firms realize that there are more people, there's a larger pool of people who are willing to purchase bonds, therefore larger pool of people willing to save, they no longer have to compete as rigorous as before. And therefore, they can afford to loosen and be a little bit more flexible and therefore reduce the rate of interest. And as a result of that, with an increase in the supply of loanable funds, the equilibrium rate of interest will fall and you would see an increase in the overall level in terms of the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds being accessible. And therefore, we realize that the equilibrium rate of interest will change whenever there are any changes in your supply curve, meaning a shift to the left or a shift to the right, or any changes in your demand curve, be it a shift to the left or a shift to the right. So it is important to understand what can cause either the demand curve or the supply curve for loanable funds to change, because it will bring about a change in the rate of interest being charged within the economy. So I hope this chapter has been very informative. I hope it has opened your mind as to how interest rates are determined according to the classicalist view. And we will now progress in the next lecture, in lecture 5B, how Keynes believes interest rates are determined. The model we will be utilizing a demand and supply model, but we realize that Keynes looks at something a little bit different as he seeks to explain his point of view on interest rate determination. Thanks for sticking to the end, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Thank you.